My name is Vanessa Hartley. I am 31 years old. And on the Saturday morning, that was supposed to be the beginning of our final stretch of wedding planning, the man I had been engaged to for 14 months stood in the center of my kitchen. In his weekend clothes, poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot I had made, looked me dead in the eyes across the granite countertop, and said, with a small, composed smile on his face, "If you're not covering the full $80,000, the wedding is off." Simple as that. He said it the way you might explain something to a child who keeps misunderstanding a concept that is, in your view, extremely clear, patient, slightly amused. With that particular brand of calm that is not actually calm at all, but is instead the performance of calm by someone who has decided they hold the superior position in the room. He was testing whether he still had it over me. And the worst part, the part that still makes me set down whatever I am holding when I think about it, is that 6 months earlier, he would have been right. 6 months earlier, I would have negotiated, apologized for something I had not done, and found a way to make the math work in his favor so that the temperature in the room could go back down. But that was not 6 months earlier. What Cody Marsh did not know, because I had not told him, because I had learned somewhere in the previous weeks that certain things are built in silence and lose their structure the moment you expose them to air, was that I had already spoken to the venue coordinator on the Thursday before that Saturday morning. I had already called our wedding planner Friday at 9:14 in the morning. I had already reviewed the cancellation clause in the Ashwood Manor contract on the Wednesday night prior, alone at my kitchen table with a legal pad, a yellow highlighter, and the precise and methodical attention to detail that I had spent 4 years developing as a financial analyst and had somehow never thought to apply to my own personal life until now. The deposit on our October wedding date at Ashwood Manor was $80,000. The contract included a cancellation provision that had a very specific structure depending on who initiated the cancellation and under what documented circumstances. I had read it enough times that I could navigate it without opening the document. I knew exactly what it meant and exactly what it required. Cody thought he was handing me an ultimatum. He was actually handing me the last piece of documentation I needed. I looked at him for a moment across the counter. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not feel the desperate, hollow lurch in my chest that I would have felt half a year before. What I felt instead was something I can only describe as a quiet settling, like the moment a gyroscope finds its axis and stops wobbling, like something that had been trying to spin out for months had finally found its center. I said, "Okay?" He nodded. He thought that was agreement. He turned back to his coffee and picked up his phone and started scrolling through something, and the conversation was, as far as he was concerned, over and resolved in his favor. This is that story. But first, before I go any further into it, I want to know who is out there right now. What part of the world are you in? What time is it where you are sitting? Drop your location and your local time in the comments, because I find it genuinely extraordinary that stories like this one travel to every corner of the earth, and I want to know who is listening. And if you have ever been in a situation where someone treated your calm, your practicality, your reasonable nature as a weakness they could lean on indefinitely, please hit subscribe. There are more of us than they ever counted on. Now, let me take you all the way back to where this actually started. Not the kitchen on that Saturday, much further. Back to a work event in Columbus, Ohio, on a Tuesday evening in late October, a little over 2 years before that kitchen conversation. My name before I married, which I did not, was Vanessa Cole. I grew up in Westerville, Ohio, the second of 2 daughters born to Patricia and Glenn Cole. My father was a civil engineer who came home quiet and stayed that way. My mother was the kind of woman who ran the household like a ship she'd spent 30 years learning to captain, and who felt a particular private hurt when the effort went unacknowledged. My older sister, Diane, was married with 2 young kids by the time I was 26 and lived 40 minutes away and called on Sundays without fail. We were not a dramatic family. We did not have the big, loud confrontations you see in movies. When something broke, you identified the problem, sourced the part, and fixed it. When something ended, you acknowledged what it was, said what needed to be said, and moved forward. I absorbed that completely and built my career on it. I had been working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment advisory firm in Columbus for 4 years when I met Cody Marsh. I met him at a work happy hour organized by a colleague neither of us knew well, at a bar in the Short North neighborhood on a rainy Tuesday. The kind of event where everyone is slightly overdressed for the venue and slightly underprepared for conversation. Cody was 34. He was tall, easy in the way some men are easy in social settings, and genuinely funny in the first 20 minutes in a way that was specific to him and not performed. He worked as a regional sales manager for a commercial flooring company that operated across 5 Midwestern states. He made good money. He drove a clean, unremarkable sedan. He had a golden retriever named Rupert, who I fell in love with approximately 4 seconds before I started falling for Cody himself. We dated for 8 months before he proposed. The proposal was at a restaurant in German Village, down on one knee at a corner table. A ring that he told me over the following weekend had cost $6,200 because he wanted me to know how serious he was. He said he showed me the receipt because he had nothing to hide. He said full transparency was important to him in a relationship. I thought at the time that this was romantic and a little unusual in the best way. I understand now that it was establishing a ledger. There was nothing wrong with him showing me what the ring cost. What mattered was that he referenced it 10 more times in the following 14 months, in context, at moments of friction, as a data point in an argument where it did not belong. The ring had cost $6,200. He had an ongoing invoice for it, and every time I failed to behave exactly as he expected, he consulted that invoice quietly but visibly enough that I could feel it. I want to tell you about what Cody Marsh was, because I think getting this right matters more than making him into a simple villain. He was not cruel in the obvious ways. He did not yell. He did not demean me in public. He was not unfaithful, as far as I know. What he was, and this took me the better part of a year to see clearly, and then to name, was a man who kept score in a relationship while insisting that scorekeeping was beneath him. A man who gave generously at the beginning of any cycle and then invoiced quietly at the end of it. A man who was most emotionally comfortable when you owed him something, when the dynamic was oriented in such a way that he was the provider and you were the recipient, and the arrangement was implicit and unsettled and ongoing. He called this being practical. He called it wanting a genuine partnership. What it actually was, as I would eventually understand with complete clarity, was a man who had built his entire relational life around the management of other people's gratitude. His family did not help me see this faster, because his family was its own confirmation of everything he had built. His parents, Earl and Carol Marsh of Dayton, Ohio, were well-presented and well-mannered and asked questions that sounded like warmth, but had the specific undertone of assessment. Carol asked what I planned to do about my career after we had children within the first hour of our second meeting. Not the first meeting, the second one, as if she had spent the interval deciding when to introduce the question. Earl asked whether I carried any debt. He phrased it as casual interest. Neither of them ever asked what I was proud of. Not once, across every dinner and holiday and long weekend we spent in their company over a year and a half, did either of them ask what I had built, or what I loved about the work I did, or what I hoped for in any direction that did not involve their son. I told myself these things were small. I had a long practice of telling myself things were smaller than they were, which is the mechanism that allows a dynamic like the one Cody and I had to persist past the point where you would normally exit it. The human capacity for minimizing what we do not want to see is genuinely remarkable when you witness it from the inside. You develop an internal editing function that is very efficient at reclassifying uncomfortable observations as overreactions, and you deploy it constantly and automatically until the day something happens that the editing function cannot process. The Saturday morning kitchen conversation was that day for me. Some things are too explicit to reclassify. The wedding planning began formally in January, 9 months after the engagement, once we had processed the initial joy and settled into the logistics of what it would actually take. We had selected an October date, which gave us 10 months of runway, which I calculated was enough time to do it well without doing it frantically. The venue we chose was Ashwood Manor, a renovated estate property 40 minutes outside Columbus, on a parcels that included formal gardens, an indoor ceremony hall with high ceilings and original plaster molding, and a reception space that seated up to 220. The all-inclusive package, which covered the venue rental, in-house catering for the reception, ceremony florals from their preferred vendor, essential lighting design, and full day of coordination, came to $112,000 before any custom additions. The deposit required to hold our October date was $80,000, due within 30 days of contract signing. Cody and I had discussed finances before the engagement in the way people in their 30s who are practical about money discuss finances. I made $94,000 a year at the firm. He earned between $110,000 and $130,000 annually depending on commission. We had agreed, in terms loose enough that I regret not tightening them at the time, that wedding costs would be shared. My parents, Glenn and Patricia, offered $10,000 as a gift when the engagement was announced, which I accepted with real gratitude and deposited into a joint savings account Cody and I had opened specifically for wedding expenses. By the time the Ashwood Manor contract arrived, that joint account held the $10,000 from my parents and approximately $6,000 we had saved together over a few months of setting aside money from each paycheck. The first explicit conversation about the $80,000 deposit happened over dinner at Cody's apartment on a Wednesday evening in early February. He had made pasta from scratch, which was one of the things about him that I genuinely loved. We were looking at the signed venue contract on his laptop together, going through the payment schedule, when he pushed back slightly from the table and said, in the reasonable and measured tone he used for things he had already decided, "I think you should cover this one." I looked up. "What do you mean, this one?" "The deposit. You have more liquidity right now. I've got a big quarterly push coming up. My cash is going to be tied up in reaching targets. It makes sense for you to front-load your contribution and we'll balance it out on the back end." I sat for a moment with that. My personal savings at that point held $17,400. The joint account held $16,000. The deposit was $80,000. I said, "Cody, I don't have $80,000 in cash," he said without blinking. "Then we look at your investment account. You've got positions you can liquidate." I had an individual brokerage account that I had been contributing to aggressively for 4 years, reinvesting dividends, holding through corrections, balancing quarterly. By that February, it held $143,000. I knew this because I monitored it closely. Cody knew this because I had shared it during the financial transparency conversation he had initiated several months earlier. At the time, that transparency had felt like intimacy. That February evening, I began to understand that it had been reconnaissance. "I'm not liquidating a long-term investment account to fund a wedding deposit," I said. "It's not liquidating for nothing," he said. "It's investing in our future." "I hear what you're saying, but we agreed to split costs, and we will. I'll handle more later." Later. I set down my fork and looked at him across the table. The word later had appeared before. It had appeared when the ring was bought, and I was expected to understand the scale of that gift and adjust my expectations about future contributions accordingly. It had appeared when he had paid for a weekend trip to Chicago that I had proposed and budgeted differently, and he had upgraded without consulting me, and then referenced the upgrade 4 months later when I declined to attend a work event he wanted us to appear at together. Later was not a timeline. It was a mechanism. It was how the ledger stayed perpetually tilted. I said, "I'd like to revisit this on the weekend when we can look at the full budget breakdown together." He agreed. The weekend came. I brought it up Saturday morning, and he said he was tired. I said, "Of course." Sunday, I brought it up again, and he said he was watching the game, and I was making something simple into something complicated. I did not push. I made a note on my phone with the date and time and what he had said, another habit from work, and then I opened my laptop and started reading the Ashwood Manor contract from the beginning. I read it as I would read any contract I was reviewing professionally, methodically, with attention to the provisions that govern what happens when things do not go according to plan, because those are always the provisions that matter most and that people most often skip in the excitement of the moment. The cancellation policy was on page 7. The language was specific. If the booking party canceled the event more than 120 days before the event date, the deposit was refundable at 80%. If the cancellation was triggered by circumstances constituting a breach of agreement by either party, a full refund was available subject to documented evidence submitted through a formal written request to the venue's management office. I read that last sentence 4 times. Then I set the contract down and sat for a long moment in the quiet of my apartment and thought about what I was doing. I was not planning anything, not yet. I was a financial analyst who had learned through thousands of hours of professional practice that when numbers stopped adding up, you went back to the sourced documents. That instinct, which had served me extremely well in my career for 4 years, was now being applied to my personal life for what I recognized as perhaps the first time, and the experience was both clarifying and slightly vertiginous. Over the next 3 weeks, 2 things happened that I did not share with Cody. The first was a conversation with my sister Diane. I drove to her house on a Thursday evenings, when her kids were in bed, and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and laid out what had been happening. Not the individual incidents in isolation, but the pattern, as I had begun to see it. The deposit conversation. The ring receipt referenced 11 times. The way contributions were framed and then recalled. The way every negotiation ended with me feeling that I had pushed back on something when in fact I had simply asked for what we had both agreed to. Diane listened without interrupting, which is what she does, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He doesn't want a partnership. He wants a creditor and a debtor, and he wants to hold the debt." I looked at her. "Is that what it is?" She said. "What does your own gut tell you?" I said that I have spent a year treating the man he was in the first 4 months as the accurate representation and adjusting everything else around that. The second thing that happened was that I called Rachel Ostroff, a real estate and contract attorney I had used 2 years earlier for a lease review on a commercial space I was considering subletting. I had kept her contact in my phone because she was exceptionally clear-headed and did not editorialize. I described the situation in general terms and sent her the relevant cancellation clauses from the Ashwood Manor contract. She called me back within 48 hours. She said, "The language here is quite favorable for a responding party. If you ever needed to use the cancellation provision, the key is documentation of who initiated the condition and when. If you have that, the path is straightforward." She asked if I was all right. I said I was getting there. She said to call her if anything developed. I want to stop here for a moment and speak directly to you if you are still watching. Because if you have made it this far into this story, something in it is resonating with you. And I want to ask you something in the comments. Have you ever stayed in a situation longer than you should have because you kept waiting for the person to go back to being who they were in the beginning? Because you thought the early version was the real version and the later version was a temporary problem? I need you to know that asking yourself that question honestly is not weakness. It is the beginning of seeing things as they actually are, and that clarity is the most valuable thing you can develop. Hit subscribe if you want to hear how this resolved, and tell me in the comments what finally made you see things clearly. I read every single one. Back to February becoming March. The deposit deadline for Ashwood Manor was now 22 days away. The venue would release our hold on the October date if the deposit was not received within the signing window. Cody had not mentioned the deposit again since the Sunday game conversation. I had not raised it either. I was watching instead of reacting. I was making notes. On a Tuesday evening, I came home from work to find Cody at my apartment. He had let himself in with the key I had given him, which I had given him in the spirit of building a shared life, and which on that particular evening felt like a different kind of thing entirely. He had helped himself to the meal prep I had made over the weekend. The lunches I had portioned carefully, because I worked through my lunch hour 3 days a week. He was standing at the counter scrolling his phone when I walked in. He looked up and said, "We need to make a decision about the deposit. The clock is running out." I said, "I know." He said, I need you to wire the $80,000 from your investment account by Friday. I will cover the reception catering separately when the quote comes in, which is going to run around $18,000, so when you look at the full picture, it balances out. I stood in the doorway. The reception catering quote was from a vendor we had not confirmed. We had not toured their kitchen. We had not agreed on a menu. The $18,000 figure had not appeared in any document I had ever seen. He had invented it that evening and was now presenting it as the counterbalancing contribution to $80,000 from my personal investment account. The math was not close. The offer was not real. It was a placeholder constructed to make the arrangement feel equitable in the moment so that I would act before thinking. I said, "I am going to need that in writing." He stared at me. "In writing. We are getting married." "Then writing it down should not be difficult." He put down his fork. He said, "This is the problem, Vanessa. You treat everything like a contract negotiation. You cannot run a marriage like a quarterly review." I said, "You are asking me to transfer $80,000 from accounts I built before we met. Based on a verbal assurance of future coverage from a vendor we have not selected for an amount you just mentioned for the first times this evening. Documentation is not unreasonable." He walked to the window. He stood there for a moment with his back to me, and the way I had learned meant he was reorganizing his approach. He turned around and said, in the voice he used when he wanted to sound unambiguously reasonable, "Here is what I need to know. Are you committed to this wedding or not? Because if you are not willing to put in what it takes, maybe we need to have a different conversation." I said, "I am committed to a marriage built on terms we both actually agreed to." He said, "Fine. We'll talk Saturday." Saturday was the kitchen conversation. He poured his coffee. He looked at me across the counter. He said with that small composed smile, "If you're not covering the full $80,000, the wedding is off. Simple as that." I looked at him for a moment. I felt the settling, the axis, the stillness that comes not from having nothing to lose but from knowing precisely what you are working with. I said, "Okay." He nodded. He thought that was agreement. He turned back to his phone. He asked if there was anything for breakfast. I told him there was Greek yogurt in the refrigerator and granola in the cupboard above the stove. He found them and made himself a bowl and stood at the counter eating it and reading something, entirely at ease, entirely unaware. I stood on the other side of the counter with my coffee and looked at him and understood with complete, final clarity something I had been resisting for months. It was not that Cody had changed. He had never changed. What had changed was how clearly I was now looking at him, and the view at that resolution was accurate in a way it had not previously been. He finished his breakfast, rinsed the bowl, set it in the rack, and said he was going to catch the afternoon game with some people from work. He said we would talk more soon. He said it with the ease of a man who believed the conversation was behind him. He kissed me on the cheek and let himself out, and I heard his car start in the parking lot, and then I heard it pull away. I stood in the kitchen for 3 minutes. Then I sat down at my desk. At 2:17 that afternoon, I sent an email to Laura Connell, the venue coordinator at Ashwood Manor, identifying myself as the primary contact on our booking and informing her that I anticipated needing to initiate a formal cancellation review and wished to understand the documented process in advance. Laura responded within 40 minutes. She expressed regret and sent over the formal cancellation request form, which required identification of the requesting party, description of the initiating circumstances, and any supporting documentation. Sunday morning, I called Rachel Ostroff. She was not technically working, but she answered because I had told her the call was time-sensitive. I walked her through the Saturday morning conversation in precise detail. She said, "He stated explicitly that the wedding was off if you did not pay the full deposit." I said yes. She said, "Say that again, and I am going to take notes." I repeated it. She took notes. She said, "That constitutes a conditional cancellation initiated by the secondary party. That is exactly the kind of documented circumstance the contract language covers. You will need the statement in writing or documented testimony from yourself at minimum." I asked her to walk me through the full process. She did, methodically, and we were on the phone for 47 minutes. Monday morning, I arrived at the office at 8:45. By 9:25, I had drafted an email to Cody's personal address. I wrote it in the same register I use for client communications. Neutral, precise, factual. I documented the Saturday morning conversation in plain language, including the exact statement he had made and the condition it attached. I noted that in response to that stated condition, I was initiating the formal cancellation process with Ashwood Manor as the responding party, and that per the cancellation provisions in the contract, the deposit would be reviewed for refund eligibility under the breach of agreement clause. I attached a summary of all personal expenses I had incurred in connection with the wedding planning over 14 months. The engagement party in November, which I had organized and funded entirely at a cost of $2,800. The save-the-date cards, design, printing, and postage at $940. The vendor consultation fees I had paid for 2 florists we ultimately decided not to use, $420. The bridal magazine subscriptions I had purchased in a moment of enthusiasm, which were small but documented. The travel costs for 2 venue tours I had driven to alone. The total of documented personal expenses came to $11,430. I copied Rachel on the email. I spent Monday evening reading it 3 more times. I removed 2 sentences that were editorializing. I added 1 clarifying paragraph stating that I bore no personal animosity and was documenting the situation to ensure all parties were operating from accurate information. I changed the word disappointed to different in 1 sentence. Neutral outlasts emotional every time. On Tuesday morning at 8:51 I sent it. Cody called at 9:14. He called 4 times in 11 minutes. I let all 4 go to voicemail. The first message was calm and asked me to call him. The second was less calm and asked what I was thinking. The third arrived at a register I had not heard from him before. Open, genuine shock. The sound of a man encountering a version of events he had not prepared for. The fourth was a single sentence. Call me back right now. I texted 11:43 after a client meeting that required my full attention. I said I would be available after 6. He texted, "This is completely insane." I said we'd talk. I didn't actually cancel anything. Rachel had told me on Sunday that the refrain would come quickly, that he would characterize the Saturday statement as rhetorical, as frustration, as hyperbole, that I had no right to act on literally. She said that was exactly why the email documentation mattered. Because a documented response to a documented statement creates a paper trail that interpretation cannot easily undo. I forwarded his text to her. She replied in under 20 minutes. 3 words. Anticipated. You're fine. I called Cody at 6:12. He had spent the day composing himself, and his voice when he answered was steady in the careful way of someone who has been rehearsing. He said, "I think we both got emotional over the weekend, and we need to walk some things back." I said, "I wasn't emotional. I was listening." He said, "I didn't mean the wedding was actually off. I was expressing frustration about the financial dynamic. You took a rhetorical statement literally." I said, You said, and I am quoting directly because I wrote it down at the time, "If you are not covering the full $80,000, the wedding is off, simple as that." Those were your words in that sequence. A pause. He said, "You wrote it down while I was standing there?" I said, "I write things down when they matter. It is a professional habit." He said, "Vanessa, come on, this is our wedding." I said, "The cancellation request has already been submitted through Ashwood Manor's formal channel. I have also notified Emma." Emma was our wedding planner, Emma Brightwell, a woman I had worked with exclusively because Cody had told me at the outset of our planning that he did not have bandwidth for vendor management. That had turned out to be one of the more useful things he had ever said. He said, "You called Emma?" I said, "I emailed her this morning." He said, "Stop. Just stop for a second. You cannot dismantle 14 months of planning over a single conversation." I said, "I am not dismantling anything. I am completing a process that was initiated on Saturday morning when you stated a condition under which the wedding was off." I responded to the condition as stated. He said, "I want to sit down and talk about this in person." I said, "That is fine. I will check my schedule and get back to you." I checked my schedule on Thursday and proposed the following Tuesday. He wanted sooner. I said Tuesday worked best. He said fine. By Tuesday, 2 things had resolved. Ashwood Manor formally confirmed the cancellation request. The preliminary deposit hold of $4,000 that we had placed to secure the date, rather than the full $80,000, which Cody had been pressuring me to transfer but which had never been wired, was subject to the 80% refund provision. $3,200 would be returned to the payment method on file, which was my account, because I had made that initial hold payment. The October date was released. Emma Brightwell sent Cody a formal invoice for work completed on the event to date. The invoice itemized vendor coordination, ceremony timeline development, design consultation for the program and signage, and 2 rounds of revisions on the ceremony script. The total was $1,200. She sent it on her business letterhead with a 30-day payment window. She also sent me a separate personal note that said, "I hope you're doing okay. The date has been released. Take care of yourself." I arrived at the coffee shop on Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon. Cody was already there. He was at a table near the window and he looked, for the first time in recent memory, like someone who had spent the previous 7 days with the wind knocked out of him, not broken, not diminished in any permanent sense, just smaller than he had appeared when he held the leverage. And I appeared not to know it. He had not ordered anything for me. I went to the counter and got my own coffee and sat across from him. He said, "I want to understand what you've done." I said, "I initiated a cancellation process in response to the condition you stated on Saturday. I documented the relevant communications, notified the applicable vendors, and reviewed the contract terms with my attorney." He said, "You have an attorney." I said, "I have had one for several years. I use her for contracts." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've been planning this." I said, "I have been reading the documents available to me and responding to what was said. That is different from planning." He leaned forward. He said, "Vanessa, I made a mistake on Saturday. I was stressed and I pushed too hard and I am sorry for that. But you have to understand that what you have done in response is completely disproportionate." I looked at him. The apology was real in the specific sense that he was genuinely uncomfortable with the outcome. But he was apologizing for the consequence, not for the behavior. He was sorry the Saturday statement had not produced the intended result. He was not sorry he had issued it. "These are different things," I said. "I appreciate you saying that. I want to be honest with you about something I have been sitting with for a long time." Saturday's conversation was not an isolated incident. It was the most explicit version of a pattern that has been present throughout our engagement. The financial pressure applied without agreement. The movement of expectations after the fact. The way every contribution you made was maintained as a credit in a ledger that you alone kept and consulted. I stayed because I told myself I was imagining it or making it larger than it was. I am clear now that I was doing neither. He said, "That's not fair." I said, "You asked me to transfer $80,000 from personal investment accounts I built before we met, based on a verbal assurance of coverage from a vendor you had not confirmed for an amount you had invented that evening. When I asked for documentation, you said we were getting married as though that replaced the need for clarity. You showed me the receipt for the engagement ring on day 1 because you said full transparency mattered to you. That transparency was only ever expected to run in one direction." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He looked out the window at the parking lot. He said quietly, "So that is it. 14 months and it ends over a conversation about money." I said, "It ends over what that conversation finally made clear about everything that had come before it. The money was always going to surface eventually." Saturday moved the timeline. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I thought you were the one person who would not do this to me." I said, "I am not doing anything to you. I am responding to something you said." He said, "My mother is going to be devastated." I thought about Carol Marsh asking whether I had debt within the first hour of our second meeting. I thought about the way her questions had been like curiosity and felt like audits. I thought about Earl asking what I planned to do about my career after children. I thought about how in 18 months of dinners and holidays, neither of them had once asked what I was proud of. I said, "I am genuinely sorry that this is painful for your family." He left first. I finished my coffee alone at the table and looked out the window at the gray March afternoon and let myself sit with what had just happened without rushing to decide how I felt about it. The trees outside were just beginning to consider the possibility of green. A few weeks from now, they would follow through on it, regardless of whether anyone was watching. I thought about the moment very early in our relationship when Cody had come to watch me present a quarterly analysis to our firm's senior partners. He had sat at the back of the conference room, and afterward in the elevator, he had looked at me and said, genuinely and without any performance, "You were the most prepared person in that room, and they all knew it." I had loved him for saying it. I still think he meant it. What I know now is that he filed that information away differently than I imagined he had, not as something to protect, as something to account for in his planning. That night, and for several nights after, I cried. I want to say that clearly because I think there is a version of this story where the narrator is supposed to be entirely composed and untouched by the resolution, and that would not be honest. 14 months was real. The man Cody had been in the first 4 months was real in the way that first impressions are real even when they are incomplete. The October I had imagined was real in the way that any future you allow yourself to picture becomes real inside you. Losing that version of the future was a specific kind of grief. I cried on the phone with Diane, who was steady and present the way she has always been. I cried alone in my kitchen at 11 at night with no audience and no performance, just the actual sadness of a thing ending. You are allowed to make the right decision and still grieve what you thought you were building. Those two things are not contradictory. They do not cancel each other out. The grief is not evidence that you made the wrong choice. It is evidence that you had genuinely hoped. By April, the $3,200 refund had arrived. Cody paid Emma's $1,200 invoice after a brief exchange. He sent me a text in mid-April asking about a small piece of jewelry that had belonged to his grandmother, which I had borrowed for the engagement party and returned to him 3 weeks later in the original velvet pouch. I confirmed I had already returned it. He said, "Thank you." I said, "Of course." His mother called me once in early April from a number I did not immediately recognize. She said that Cody was having a difficult time and asked if there was any possibility of reconsidering the situation. She said, "I always thought you were a sensible girl, Vanessa." I said I appreciated that and that I wished Cody well. His father called 2 weeks later and covered similar ground, and then at the end of the call asked about the ring. I told him I had already consulted an attorney on the matter and would follow the applicable process. I sent the ring back via certified mail in late April, fully insured, with tracking, in a padded envelope inside a small box, along with a handwritten card that said only, "Wishing you well." I signed it, Vanessa. The ring had been worth $6,200. I had been informed of this 11 times over 14 months. I counted. There is something I want to say to anyone watching this who is somewhere in the middle of what I have described. Not at the resolution, not at the very beginning where everything is still ambiguous, but in that complicated territory in between, where you can see both versions of the person clearly, and the gap between those two versions is the place where you currently live. The version they were and the version they are. The future you imagined and the present you cannot keep pretending is temporary. You are allowed to gather information before you act. You are allowed to read the documents of your own life with the same attention you give to anything else that matters. The decision to stop does not have to be dramatic. It does not have to be a performance for an audience. It does not have to fill a room with noise. The quietest decisions I have ever made have been the most durable. The loudest ones, the ones I made reactively before I was ready, cost me more than any calm decision ever has. Here is what Cody Marsh never accounted for. He had watched me work for 14 months. He had watched me read contracts and model projections and review financial statements with a precision that was fundamental to who I was professionally. He knew this about me. He had expressed genuine admiration for it in the early months, the way he said, "You are so sharp," the way he spoke about my work to his colleagues at events. And yet, when he structured the financial dynamics of our engagement, he operated as if my professional capability had an off switch that he controlled. As if inside our relationship, I became someone different from the person I was everywhere else. That is the thing about underestimating someone. You see their capability. You simply assume it has a boundary at the edge of their relationship with you. Months after the Tuesday coffee shop conversation, when the lease on my current apartment was ending, I moved into a new place with west-facing windows that caught the afternoon light in a way the old one never had. Diane brought her kids to help. They carried boxes with tremendous seriousness and provided almost no measurable assistance. We ordered pizza and ate it on the floor because the furniture had not arrived yet, and Diane looked around the apartment and said, "You look like yourself again." I said I felt like myself again. She said, "That's what I meant." I did not have to ask her what she meant. My promotion to senior analyst came through in the autumn. I bought a coffee maker I had been considering for 2 years, a good one, the kind that does one thing extremely well and requires no management once you understand it. I had been delaying that purchase in the unconscious way you delay things when you are managing someone else's vision of what your life should look like. When it arrived and I made the first cup from it on a Tuesday morning at 7:15, standing in the west-facing kitchen with the light coming in, I thought, this is the most ordinary thing and also the most mine. I keep a copy of the Ashwood Manor contract in a folder in my desk, not as a trophy, not to revisit the specific pain of it. I keep it as a reminder that the language which protects you is always there if you take the time to read it. In personal decisions and in professional ones, and in the ones that sit uncomfortably between the two, the fine print is not the frightening part. The fine print is the part that tells you the truth when everything around it has been performing. Cody Marsh is, as far as I can tell, doing well. He posted on social media in the summer and looked like himself. I was genuinely glad to see it, because the person I spent 14 months with was a real person who had genuine warmth in him, genuine humor, moments of real kindness that were not strategic. He was not a villain in the clean, uncomplicated sense. He was a man who had developed a system for his relationships over many years, and had operated inside that system for long enough that he had stopped noticing he was in one. That is, its own kind of limitation, its own kind of trap. The ring cost $6,200. I knew that number better than he knew, I knew it. But the clearest cost of those 14 months was not financial. It was the sustained, daily expenditure of mental and emotional attention I spent adjusting my own instincts to accommodate a dynamic I kept describing to myself as temporary. That energy is not returnable. What I got back when it was over was the part of myself that had been running quietly in the background for a year, without full access, the part that reads the documents, checks the math, examines the assumptions, and trusts the conclusion. I am 31 years old. I have excellent liquidity, a clear desk, and a coffee maker that brews one precise cup every morning at 7:15. I take it to my window and drink it while the light comes through from the west, and I attend to whatever needs attending with the full and undivided focus of a person who has no outstanding balances and nothing on anyone else's ledger. To anyone watching this who has been handed an ultimatum framed as love, or been asked to prove commitment through a financial transaction that was never part of any agreement you actually made, or been told that wanting documentation makes you rigid and unromantic and not a real partner, I want you to hear something. Wanting clarity is not a character flaw. Wanting to understand the terms before you sign is not coldness. It is the same intelligence you apply to every other meaningful decision in your life, and you are not required to switch it off the moment a relationship is involved. You are not broken for reading the fine print of your own life. You are, in fact, the most prepared person in the room. The most dangerous thing about being competent and calm and self-possessed is that some people will interpret those qualities as passivity. They will mistake your patience for acceptance and your quietness for agreement and your steady measured responses for a lack of backbone. They are miscounting. What they are reading as acquiescence is actually preparation. And the people who tell you otherwise are counting on you not to notice that. The question I want to leave you with today is this. Was there ever a moment where someone in your life, romantic or otherwise, assumed you would not act because you never had before? Where they built their whole approach on the belief that you would stay because staying was what you always did. Tell me in the comments what finally made you put down the pen and step back from the table. I am in the comments. I read everyone. And every story there reminds me that the quietest people in every room are almost always the ones who have already done the math. Thank you for being here today. I want to say that with something more than habit, because this channel is made for exactly the stories that are hardest to tell out loud. Every woman who has ever been handed a bill for her own life in the language of love and partnership, every woman who built something quietly, while someone else assumed she was not building anything at all, deserves to hear her story reflected back with the care it took to live it. We tell these stories every single day on Revenge Diary, and we will be here tomorrow with another one. Subscribe so you are here for it. Share this if someone in your life needs to hear it. And know that wherever you are watching from tonight, you are not as alone in this as you have been made to feel. I will see you in the next one.